Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister and asks, does he stand by his comment in relation to claims that investors are able to sue governments for breaches of free trade agreements, that such claims are, quote, far-fetched?
The Honourable Tim Groser.
On behalf of the Prime Minister, yes.
Dr Russell Norman.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. To the Prime Minister, does the New Zealand-China Free Trade Agreement have provisions that allow investors to sue the New Zealand government?
The Honourable Tim Groser.
The provisions negotiated, and may I congratulate the previous government on negotiating these safeguards, have provisions which allow investors to raise issues of concern, but there are very careful safeguards in that agreement, and the agreement has worked extremely satisfactorily.
Dr Russell Norman.
Supplementary. Given that the Minister has just agreed that the New Zealand-China Free Trade Agreement has provisions that allow investors to sue the New Zealand government, how can it possibly be true that claims that such provisions exist are far-fetched?
The Honourable Tim Groser.
Because they are far-fetched. They are deeply implausible.
Dr Russell Norman.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I just couldn't hear the end. Point of order, I couldn't hear the end of the Minister's answer. I wonder if the Minister could repeat the end of it. I couldn't hear it.
I think that's a fair request. The Honourable Tim Groser.
Yes, I redefine far-fetched as deeply implausible.
Implausible. Dr Russell
Thank
Norman.
you, Mr Speaker. If a Chinese corporation were to sue New Zealand under the investor-state disputes mechanism of the New Zealand-China Free Trade Agreement, would the case be heard in New Zealand?
The Honourable Tim Groser. And before I call the Minister, can I ask the members on the front benches, please, to cease the interjections? I'm struggling to hear. The Honourable Tim Groser.
Mr Speaker, on behalf of the Prime Minister, there are detailed provisions in the relevant clauses, I think clause 152, 153, that set out procedures. At the very end of the day, there is a provision for a neutral observer to come in and make a judgment, but we have never encountered that, and I don't expect to.
Dr Russell Norman.
Point of order, Mr Speaker.
Point of order, Dr Russell Norman.
The question was, would this case be heard in New Zealand? And I don't believe the Minister addressed that.
The member can repeat his question so there can be no uncertainty, because there was the noise level meant that I was struggling to hear it. So I invite the member to repeat.
Speaker. If a Chinese corporation were to sue New Zealand under the investor-states dispute mechanism of the New Zealand-China Free Trade Agreement, would the case be heard in New Zealand?
The Honourable Tim Groser.
Mr Speaker, on behalf of the Prime Minister, not necessarily. It could be held in Beijing.
Dr Russell Norman.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Is it not the case that under Article 153 of the New Zealand-China Free Trade Agreement, in fact, the dispute would be heard under the auspices of the World Bank or the United Nations, and there is absolutely no guarantee that it would be heard in New Zealand at all?
The Honourable Tim Groser.
Mr Speaker, on behalf of the Prime Minister, there are detailed provisions in the agreement, there are adequate safeguards to protect the sovereignty of the New Zealand Government, and we are very happy with the way the agreement is proceeding.
Point of order, Dr Russell Norman.
Mr Speaker, it was a very specific non-political question about a specific provision of the Free Trade Agreement about where the dispute will be heard. I asked whether the Minister agreed that it said in clause Article 153 that it would be heard under the World Bank or the United Nations. It's a simple question.
But the member went on to ask, if I remember correctly, and does that mean that it would not necessarily be held in New Zealand? And the Minister already answered that question. He'd already indicated that it could be held offshore. The answer to the previous question had covered that, and that's why I believe the Minister had answered that question, because he already acknowledged that it could be held offshore. Supplementary, Dr Russell Norman.
Supplementary, Mr Speaker. Does the Prime Minister stand by his comment that he would rule out signing the Trans-Pacific Partnership Agreement if the TPP includes investor-state dispute mechanisms that allow investors to sue governments?
The Honourable Tim Groser.
Mr Speaker, on behalf of the Prime Minister has regarded this as far-fetched. I do not recall the statement which the member used by the Prime Minister.
Point of order. I invite the member this occasion to repeat his question, because he, as I understood that question, wasn't referring back to the Prime Minister's statement. It was actually asking specifically with respect to the Trans-Pacific Partnership provisions. I invite Dr Russell Norman to repeat his question.
Let me attempt to be...
Oh, no order. I've invited him to repeat his question. The member should respect that.
Will he rule out signing the Trans-Pacific Partnership Agreement if the TPP includes investor-state dispute mechanisms that allow investors to sue governments?
The Honourable Tim Groser.
Mr Speaker, on behalf of the Prime Minister, the answer is that we will look carefully at these provisions. They're not yet negotiated, and we will give an unqualified assurance to the New Zealand public that we will carefully safeguard the sovereignty of New Zealand to entertain good public policy in accordance with the principles of open government.
Dr Russell Norman.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Will the Prime Minister rule out signing the Trans-Pacific Partnership Agreement if the TPP includes investor-state dispute mechanisms that allow investors to sue governments? Yes or no?
The Honourable Tim Groser.
Mr Speaker, I've already answered that. We're dealing with a hypothetical situation. The Prime Minister has made it quite clear what the government's position is. This is a far-fetched, hypothetical hunt, and I will not go beyond the statements the Prime Minister has issued.
Question. Point of order, Dr Russell Norman.
Mr Speaker, I seek leave to table Chapter 11, Section 2 of the New Zealand-China Free Trade Agreement called Investor-State Dispute Resolution.
Leave is sought to table that part of that document. Is there any objection? There is no objection. Point of order, Dr Russell Norman.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I seek leave to table the claims, all the cases that have been lost under NAFTA in which corporations have sued governments and won many hundreds of millions of dollars against US governments.
What's this document?
It's a table of NAFTA Chapter 11 cases, published in November 2010.
Leave is sought to table that document from NAFTA. Is there any objection? There is objection. Question number... point of order, Dr Russell Norman.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I seek leave to table the transcript of the Prime Minister's comments about investor-state dispute resolution mechanisms. They're not publicly available, otherwise we transcribe it from the videotape.
Order. Leave is sought to table this document. Is there any objection? There is objection. Question number 11, the Honourable Trevor Mallard.